The Great Chicago Fire, Birth of Modern America. Part 1, A City of Fire and Iron. October 8th, 1871. The air was strange that night, too warm for autumn, too dry for comfort. In the stables behind Patrick and Catherine O'Leary's small wooden house on Pullman Street, the smell of hay mixed with the bitter tang of smoke that had been drifting in from the western plains all week. Even the lake wind, usually cool and sharp, carried the restless scent of heat. Chicago was a city made of wood, not just its houses, its sidewalks, bridges, fences, even the outhouses behind the grandest mansions were wood. A single spark could turn it all into a funeral pyre. No one knew it yet, but in a few hours, the city that had risen faster than any in the nation's history would burn faster than any before it. The spark. The legend says it began with a cow, Mrs. O'Leary's cow to be exact, kicking over a lantern in the barn. Mrs. O'Leary always denied it. "I was in bed," she swore later, her thick Irish accent trembling with fury and shame. "I never milked the cow that night." The truth is murkier. What we know, around 9 p.m., fire was seen in the O'Leary barn at 137 Pullman Street. Whether from a lantern, a careless worker, or spontaneous combustion among the dry hay, the flames caught and spread almost instantly. The summer had been brutally dry, not a drop of rain in weeks, and Chicago's buildings were tinder boxes waiting for a match. Within minutes, the fire leapt to the next property. By 9:30, flames were vaulting over rooftops, devouring wood shingles, cracking windows with bursts of heat. A strong southwest wind, nearly 30 miles per hour, carried sparks across the narrow alleys and wooden fences. A sleeping city. When the first alarm rang out from engine number 6, the men were exhausted. They'd battled a large blaze the previous night and were running on fumes. The alarm box nearest to Pullman Street was broken, one of many neglected due to corruption in the city's fire department budget. Instead, the alarm came from a box nearly a mile away. By the time the first engines arrived, whole blocks were aflame. Captain William Moosham of engine number 5 recalled years later, "We thought it was another barn fire, maybe a stable or two. But when we turned the corner of Taylor Street, we saw the sky itself was burning. The hoses sputtered, the water pressure weak. The men swore, pumped harder, but the flames roared back like a living thing. The wooden sidewalks caught fire beneath their boots. Buckets melted, roofs collapsed. The air filled with embers, glowing red like a snowstorm in hell." The wind turns. By midnight, the fire had consumed the west side and was racing toward the south branch of the Chicago River. But the river, choked with lumber yards, tar factories, and oil barrels, didn't stop the fire. It fed it. Tar boiled, oil exploded, and burning debris jumped the water like sparks over a candle. Eyewitness Horace White, editor of the Chicago Tribune, described the moment the fire crossed the river. "It was not a flame leaping, but a storm descending. The fire fell from the heavens in sheets. The air itself seemed to burn." The Tribune's own building, made of brick and iron, was thought to be fireproof. By 2:30 a.m., it too was engulfed. The great presses that had shouted Chicago's news to the world now melted in molten puddles. Panic in the streets. People fled northward, thousands of them, clutching children, trunks, dogs, Bibles. The streets jammed with carts and wagons, horses bucking in terror. Sparks rained down on hats and shawls. The wooden bridges that crossed the river caught fire one by one, trapping the fleeing crowds. In the mansions of Prairie Avenue, the wealthy packed silver and portraits into carriages. Some tried to bribe coachmen with gold to take them farther north, but the drivers often stole the gold and vanished. By 4 a.m., the courthouse bell tower collapsed, sending a rain of molten iron into the streets. The bell's final peal was drowned by the roar of the inferno. A city without a sky. Morning never came properly that day. The sun rose behind a curtain of smoke so thick it turned orange and then disappeared entirely. People stumbled through the haze, eyes streaming, mouths blackened with soot. The fire marched north, devouring everything in its path, from the lumber yards to the North Division, to the mansions along Lincoln Park. Even the elegant homes of the elite, built of supposed fireproof materials, fell like tinder. Windows shattered from the heat, curtains ignited without touching flame. By the second night, nearly the entire city center was gone. An empire of ashes. When the rain finally came on October 10th, it hissed over a smoking wasteland. Chicago, the proud queen of the West, home to 300,000 people, America's fastest-growing city, was gone. An estimated 17,500 buildings destroyed, 100,000 people homeless, damage equivalent to $4 billion today. The Chicago River was choked with burned timbers, dead horses, iron girders twisted like paper. The ground itself was too hot to walk on. But in the ruins, something stirred, not just grief, but ambition. As one eyewitness, young reporter Carl Sandburg would later write, "It was as if the fire burned away not only wood and stone, but doubt. In the ashes, a new city began to dream itself." Seeds of rebirth. By October 12th, businessmen were already gathering in tents and taverns, sketching plans. Insurance adjusters, bankers, and speculators flooded in. Out of tragedy came a fever of opportunity. The fire had wiped out not only homes, but old money, old power, and old rules. A new kind of city would rise, faster, taller, steel-born. At the heart of this rebirth would be the men and women who refused to leave. Joseph Mattel, newspaper magnate and moral crusader, who saw the fire as divine punishment for Chicago's sins. George Pullman, the ruthless industrialist who would rebuild not just factories, but a new kind of worker city. And Jane Byrne, a young nurse and later reformer, who saw the human cost of progress. And in the shadows, the web of political corruption that would define Chicago's machine for generations. The Great Fire had destroyed the city, but it had also cleared the way for America's modern age. Part 2. Ashes of Gold. The Rebuilding and the Rise of Industrial America. The rain that fell on the evening of October 10, 1871, did not cleanse Chicago. It revealed her bones. Beneath the blackened rubble, the twisted rails, the heaps of glass and cinders, lay a city both dead and alive, a creature waiting to molt. The smell of smoke lingered for weeks, seeping into everything. Even the survivors said that for years afterward, they could taste the fire whenever the wind blew from the west. In the first days after the inferno, Chicago looked like the aftermath of war. Entire districts flattened, ash ankle-deep, the skyline reduced to chimneys and skeletal frames. Cows wandered through the ruins, gnawing at burned games. Dogs howled among the corpses. Survivors built shanties from sheet metal, boards and doors salvaged from the wreckage. They called them fireproof homes, with a grim joke. Yet, amid the devastation, something remarkable happened. The city refused to die. The morning after. At dawn on October 11th, Joseph Medill, editor and co-owner of the Chicago Tribune, picked through the ruins of his printing office. The great iron press lay in a molten heap, its letters fused together. But instead of despairing, Medill scrawled a makeshift headline on chalk on a board propped against a brick wall. "Chicago shall rise again." He meant it. By that afternoon, the Tribune was printing again on borrowed presses in the suburb of Lamont. The paper's message spread across the Midwest like wildfire. Send aid, send lumber, send men. Chicago will rebuild. And America responded. Trains arrived daily from Milwaukee, St. Louis, New York, Cincinnati, packed with food, blankets, tools, and volunteers. Donations poured in from across the world. Queen Victoria, the Pope, and even Sultan Abdulaziz of the Ottoman Empire sent money. San Francisco, a rival city, wired $20,000 within days. Chicago was no longer just a city. It had become a national symbol of resilience. From ashes to opportunity. While the poor dug through ruins for food and shelter, the city's business elite saw something different, a blank slate. The fire had erased the past, the tangled streets, the old property lines, the rotting wood tenements that reformers had long condemned. To the men who had built Chicago's fortune, lumber barons, railroad tycoons, grain merchants, this was not tragedy, but a chance. "Gentlemen," said George Pullman, raising a glass at a gathering of industrialists only a week after the fire, "the Almighty has done our surveying for us." They laughed, too loudly, some thought, but they understood. In the smoldering ruins lay the opportunity to design a new kind of city. Steel, glass, and profit. The rebuilding would make men rich. It would also expose the corrupt machinery that powered American capitalism. Enter the politicians. The city's government, as such it was, had collapsed in the chaos. Mayor Roswell B. Mason, a quiet engineer turned politician, was overwhelmed. In the first days after the fire, he deputized a private militia, 1,000 armed men, many Civil War veterans, to prevent looting and restore order. But the true power quickly shifted elsewhere, to the relief committees, business councils, and insurance companies that held the money. Insurance adjusters descended on Chicago like locusts. Over 100 companies faced ruin. The claims were astronomical, and many firms simply refused to pay. Act of God, they said, no coverage. 1 out of every 3 claims was denied. People who had lost everything received nothing but a polite letter of regret. Meanwhile, speculators bought the ashes. Whole blocks of land went for pennies on the dollar as desperate owners sold what little they had left to feed their families. Within months, new fortunes were being made on ruins still warm. Medill's crusade. Joseph Medill saw this corruption and burned with moral fury. His paper, the Tribune, began calling for reform. He wrote editorials that thundered across the nation. The fire was no accident of nature alone. It was the sin of a city that built in greed and drank in pride. Let us rebuild, but let us also repent. Medill ran for mayor that fall, not as a businessman, but as a reformer. He promised strict building codes, moral order, and temperance. The slogan on his campaign posters read, "Chicago must rise clean." The voters, weary of corruption and chaos, elected him. He became Mayor Joseph Medill, the man who would try to turn ashes into purity. But purity was not profitable, and the men of profit would not go quietly. The Rebuilders. In the months following the fire, new names began to define Chicago. William LeBaron Jenney, a young engineer and veteran of the Civil War, who dreamed of building structures not of wood or brick, but of iron and steel, a radical idea that would give birth to the skyscraper. Marshall Field, the retail magnate, who vowed to rebuild his destroyed department store bigger than ever. George Pullman, who would create a model industrial town south of the city, a shining vision of order built on strict control of workers' lives. Daniel Burnham, then a draftsman with big ideas and no money, who would later remake Chicago's skyline. They were the new architects of America's industrial age, men who saw in the fire not destruction, but divine permission to rebuild the world. The poor left behind. While the rich drafted blueprints and hired architects, the poor huddled in the ashes. Tens of thousands lived in makeshift tents and shanties through the brutal winter of 1871-72. Disease spread: typhoid, dysentery, smallpox. The relief agencies did what they could, but donations dwindled. The fire poor, as they were called, became a burden the new city wanted to forget. Immigrant labor, Irish, German, Scandinavian, Bohemian, rebuilt the streets, brick by brick. They earned pennies a day, laying foundations for mansions they could never enter. Many died from exhaustion or burns. No statues bear their names. The rebuilt Chicago, gleaming and modern, would rise on their bones. Steel and the city of the future. By 1873, only 2 years after the fire, the skyline began to change. The first iron-framed buildings appeared, taller and stronger than anything before. The streets were widened. Stone and brick replaced wood. Architects experimented with new materials, fireproof tiles, cast iron columns, and soon steel beams. William Jenney's design for the Home Insurance Building, 1885, though still years away, had its roots in the fire's lesson: nothing built of wood would endure. From these ashes came not just buildings, but an idea that a city could grow upward, not outward. Chicago became a laboratory for modern architecture, the birthplace of the American skyline. The return of corruption.
But as the towers rose, so did the old vices. Contracts for rebuilding went to friends and donors. Inspectors were bribed to overlook shoddy work. New fire codes were passed and ignored. Medill, exhausted and disillusioned, served only 2 years before resigning. "The fire burned our city," he said bitterly, "but greed has scorched its soul." Into that vacuum stepped the first real Chicago machine, a network of politicians, contractors, and ward bosses who would run the city for the next century. The fire had not destroyed corruption. It had merely cleared the stage for it to evolve. A nation watching. Across the country, people watched Chicago's rebirth in awe. Newspapers called it the miracle of the West. Visitors came by train to see the new buildings, the glittering boulevards, the bustling stockyards. What they saw was not just a city, but a symbol, the American idea that destruction breeds creation, that no setback is permanent if you have the will and the capital to rise again. By the late 1870s, Chicago's population had surpassed 500,000. Its factories churned out steel, rail cars, furniture, and dreams. The fire had burned away the old city, but from its embers, modern America was born. The price of progress. Yet even as the city soared, its divisions deepened. The rich built mansions along Michigan Avenue. The poor lived in soot-streaked tenements by the river. The contrast was obscene, and it would not last forever. For in the shadows of the new skyline, a new kind of fire was smoldering, not of wood or coal, but of anger. The workers who rebuilt Chicago had begun to see their own power. Unions were forming. Strikes loomed. The same ambition that had fueled the city's rebirth would soon drive it to the brink of violence again. But that is another chapter. The Great Chicago Fire, Birth of Modern America, Part 3, Iron and Blood, The Rise of Labor, and the Battle for Chicago. By the mid-1870s, the city that rose from the ashes was unrecognizable. The streets that once smelled of char and ruin now pulsed with the rhythm of hammers, trains, and human ambition. Chicago was not just rebuilt, it was reinvented. From its smoking ruins had risen factories so vast that they seemed to breathe. Rail lines crisscrossed the city like veins of steel, carrying meat, lumber, coal, and men. The skyline grew jagged, a forest of smokestacks and grain elevators reaching into the gray sky. But beneath the proud roar of industry, another sound echoed, the murmur of hunger. The workers' city. By 1880, Chicago was the fastest-growing city in the world. Immigrants poured in from Ireland, Germany, Bohemia, Sweden, and Poland. They built the railroads, slaughtered the hogs, forged the iron, and slept in rooms barely large enough to breathe in. In the stockyards, men worked 12 hours a day for barely $1. The air reeked of blood, lard, and rot. Rats ran along the rafters. A worker could lose a hand to a machine and be replaced within the hour. The city's elite, the Pullmans, Fields, Armours, and Swifts, lived in marble houses along Prairie Avenue. Their wives attended European balls, while their workers' children slept 5 to a bed. Chicago was a monument to progress and a tinderbox of resentment. Pullman's dream. No man embodied both the genius and cruelty of this new age like George Pullman. After the fire, Pullman had become one of Chicago's richest men, manufacturing luxury sleeping cars for the nation's railroads. To house his workers, he built a model town, Pullman, Illinois, just south of the city. It was meant to be a paradise of order. Neat red brick homes, manicured lawns, a church, a library, and a market. But it was a paradise with a price. Pullman owned every building, every store, every blade of grass. Workers' wages went straight back to the company through rent and overpriced goods. He called it industrial harmony. His workers called it a gilded cage. Still, for a time, it worked. Visitors praised the town as proof that capitalism could be benevolent, that the chaos of Chicago could be tamed by paternal design. But no design could contain the growing storm. The Panic of 1873. The boom years crashed hard. Banks failed, factories closed, and railroads halted construction. Tens of thousands lost their jobs overnight. Men marched through the streets holding signs that read, "We want work or bread." The police broke up demonstrations with clubs and gunfire. Mayor Medill,
once the moral voice of the city, was gone, replaced by politicians who answered to the factory owners. In the 10 years after the fire, Chicago had gone from ashes to empire. But an empire built on desperation cannot stand forever. The unions rise. By 1877, the city's workers had begun to organize. Inspired by European socialism and American trade unionism, they met in taverns, church basements, and secret halls. Germans printed pamphlets calling for shorter hours and fair wages. Irish laborers formed the Brotherhood of Railwaymen. Women, too, joined, especially in the garment and packing industries. The slogan was simple, almost naive: 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. The industrial barons scoffed. 8 hours, scoffed Marshall Field. You can't build an empire on leisure. The conflict was inevitable. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877. That summer, a national railroad strike spread like wildfire from Baltimore to Pittsburgh to Chicago. Trains stopped, depots burned, and for a moment, workers held the city hostage. On July 25, 1877, thousands gathered at the Halsted Street Viaduct, waving red flags. The police, bolstered by militia, fired into the crowd. 20 protesters were killed. The Chicago Times called it anarchy. The Tribune called it justice. But the blood spilled on Halsted Street watered something powerful: solidarity. The movement did not die. It merely hardened. The Haymarket Bruise. The 1880s brought prosperity for the few and misery for the many. Chicago's population now topped 800,000. Its factories never slept. Labor leaders like Albert Parsons, a former Confederate soldier turned radical, and August Spice, a German immigrant printer, began calling for nationwide strikes to demand the 8-hour day. Their voices filled beer halls and union halls alike. To the business elite, they were dangerous men, foreign agitators, socialists, enemies of progress. To the working poor, they were heroes. By May 1st, 1886, Chicago was the epicenter of a nationwide labor uprising. Over 80,000 workers marched down Michigan Avenue chanting, 8 hours or nothing. For once, the city trembled not from fire, but from the power of its people. The Haymarket, the night of fire and iron. On the evening of May 4th, 1886, a rally was held in Haymarket Square, west of downtown. It was meant to be peaceful, a protest against police brutality after officers had shot striking workers at the McCormick Reaper Works 2 days earlier. The weather was damp, the crowd thinning as night fell. Parsons spoke passionately, calling for justice, not violence. Even the mayor, Carter Harrison, had visited earlier and found the event calm. He went home, satisfied. Then, as police moved in to disperse the last few hundred protesters, a bomb exploded. The blast tore through the ranks, killing one officer instantly, wounding dozens. Panic erupted. The police opened fire blindly into the smoke and chaos. When it was over, 7 policemen and at least 4 civilians were dead, though no one knew how many were shot by police themselves. The newspapers exploded the next morning. Anarchy and murder in Chicago. The city that had once burned with flame now burned with fear. The Haymarket Martyrs. The hunt for the bombers began immediately. Police raided union halls, German newspapers, and private homes. Dozens were arrested, though no one ever proved who threw the bomb. 8 men were put on trial: Parsons, Spice, and 6 others, all labor leaders and anarchists. The evidence was weak, but the verdict was predetermined. The judge called them enemies of civilization. The prosecutor said, "These men are tried for what they did, but for what they believe." On November 11, 1887, 4 of them were hanged. Parsons kissed his wife and cried out from the gallows, "Let the voice of the people be heard." Their deaths shocked the world. To the working class, they were martyrs. To the elite, they were a warning. To history, they were the spark of a movement that would not die. Chicago's dual soul. By the dawn of the 1890s, Chicago was 2 cities, one of steel and wealth, one of sweat and sorrow. The fire of 1871 had forged an empire, but also a divide that would define the nation itself, the war between capital and labor. And yet, amid the blood and betrayal, something extraordinary persisted, a vision of what America could be. The workers who fell at Haymarket did not vanish. Their dream lived on in unions, reforms, and rights that would one day become law. Chicago had burned once by accident. It was burning again, this time by choice, by the heat of human struggle. Out of that furnace would come the modern American century.
Part 4. White City, the World's Fair and the Reinvention of the American Dream. By the winter of 1890, Chicago stood unrecognizable from the ruin of 1871. Steel towers rose where ashes once smoldered. The skyline glimmered with gaslight and the early flicker of electric bulbs. The city that had burned to the ground 2 decades earlier was now the industrial capital of the United States, second only to New York in power and ambition. But the people of Chicago were hungry for something more than industry. They wanted beauty. They wanted redemption. They wanted the world to see that the city, once called a cesspool of greed and soot, could outshine every capital on earth. That chance came when Congress announced a contest. Which city would host the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, the grand celebration of the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage? New York, Washington, and St. Louis all clamored for it, but Chicago, brash, rebuilt, and burning with pride, fought harder. The battle for the fair. Chicago's case was led by Carter Harrison, the charismatic cigar-chomping mayor, and Marshall Field, the department store titan. Backing them were railroad barons, bankers, and industrial giants who poured millions into lobbying Congress. New York scoffed. Chicago, a city of hogs and smoke, let them host a stockyard exhibition instead. That insult lit a fuse under Chicago's pride. When the votes were counted, it was close, but Chicago won. The city exploded in celebration. Cannons boomed from the lakefront. Church bells rang for hours. Newspapers shouted, "Chicago beats the East. The fair is ours." But victory was only the beginning. Now they had to build a world. Daniel Burnham and the Dream. To design the fair, the organizers chose Daniel H. Burnham, a tall, commanding architect with a steely jaw and the confidence of a general. Burnham, once a young draftsman wandering jobless after the fire, now ran one of the largest architecture firms in the nation. His mission, to transform 640 acres of swampy ground in Jackson Park into a city of palaces, in less than 3 years. He assembled a dream team. Frederick Law Olmsted, the visionary landscape architect behind New York Central Park. Charles McKim, Richard Hunt, Louis Sullivan, and other leading architects of the era. George Ferris, an engineer with a radical idea, a gigantic rotating wheel taller than any structure in America.
Together, they would build a city so magnificent that it would redefine America's place in the world. The birth of the White City. Construction began in 1891, and chaos followed. Labor strikes, political graft, and impossible deadlines plagued every stage. Thousands of workers toiled through brutal winters, living in muddy camps by the lake. Many died of disease, exhaustion, or accidents, but Burnham drove them relentlessly. "Make no little plans," he told his team. "They have no magic to stir men's blood." Slowly, impossibly, the vision rose from the mud, a gleaming city of white, the White City. The buildings were not made of marble as they appeared, but of plaster and hemp fiber, painted pure white. Under sunlight, they shimmered like a dream. Broad boulevards, reflecting pools, and electric lights created an otherworldly glow. At night, the fairgrounds blazed brighter than any city on earth. It was the first time most Americans had ever seen electric illumination, and it changed them forever. A city reborn in light. When the World's Columbian Exposition opened on May 1, 1893, President Cleveland pressed a golden button, and 100,000 incandescent bulbs burst into light. The crowd gasped. The band played. The lake reflected a galaxy of man-made stars. For 6 months, more than 27 million visitors came from every corner of the world, more than the population of the entire United States when Chicago was founded. They strolled along the Court of Honor, marveled at the Ferris wheel, rode electric trains, and ate new foods like Cracker Jack, shredded wheat, and Pabst Blue Ribbon beer. The fair introduced moving walkways, automatic dishwashers, and neon signs, the seeds of the modern world. Chicago had not only risen from the ashes, it had crowned itself the capital of the future. But the shadow beneath the light. But for every marvel in the White City, there was a shadow beyond its gates. Outside the fairgrounds, in the alleys and tenements of the South Side, poverty still ruled. The workers who built Burnham's dream could not enter it. Thousands lived in Pullman's model town, still under his iron grip. Wages had been cut during a deep economic depression, but rent had not. In the summer of 1893, while visitors toasted champagne beneath the fair's glowing domes, Pullman's employees were starving. And among them walked a man named Eugene Debs, a quiet, educated railroad worker who would soon light a fire no architect could design. The fair's dual face. The fair dazzled the world with its architecture and artistry, yet it also revealed the contradictions at America's heart. In one hall, scientists displayed the latest electrical wonders. In another, exhibits of primitive peoples from colonized lands reinforced the arrogance of empire. The White City was not only named for its color, it was literally a celebration of whiteness, with African Americans largely excluded or relegated to menial roles. Ida B. Wells, Frederick Douglass, and other black leaders protested the exclusion, publishing a pamphlet titled "The Reason Why the Colored American is Not in the World's Columbian Exposition." It was distributed at the fair's gates, an act of courage amid indifference. Chicago's elites celebrated progress. Its marginalized citizens saw hypocrisy. The city that claimed to represent the American dream still refused to share it. Triumph and tragedy. For Burnham, the fair was both masterpiece and curse. He had created beauty beyond imagining, but it had nearly destroyed him. He slept little, worked endlessly, and quarreled with everyone, especially Louis Sullivan, whose bold modern designs clashed with Burnham's neoclassical vision. Sullivan would later say bitterly, "The damage wrought by the White City was not a passing thing. It set architecture back 50 years. He meant that its nostalgic grandeur blinded America to the possibilities of the modern, the steel and glass future already being born. And then, just as the fair reached its zenith, tragedy struck. On October 28, 1893, Mayor Carter Harrison, the city's beloved patriarch, was assassinated in his home by a deranged office seeker. Chicago's triumph turned instantly to mourning. The fair closed 2 days later in a somber ceremony. The White City, built in haste and glory, was soon dismantled. Within months, many of its buildings had burned or crumbled. The dream dissolved into memory. But something lasting remained: the legacy of the White City. From the fair came a new American confidence and a new vision of what cities could be. Burnham would go on to draft the Plan of Chicago, 1909, the first modern blueprint for urban design, with boulevards, parks, and civic order. The fair's electricity revolutionized industry. Its architecture inspired Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and countless courthouses across the nation. It gave Americans a taste for spectacle and a belief that progress was destiny. Yet the same fair also widened the gulf between the gilded and the grim. The glittering vision of order was paid for by labor's exhaustion and exclusion. The Pullman Strike was already brewing, and within a year it would tear the illusion apart. Chicago between worlds. When the last lights of the fair flickered out in late autumn, the city seemed strangely quiet. The crowds had gone, the music silenced. Only the wind off Lake Michigan remained, whistling through the empty colonnades of the Court of Honor. The White City was gone, but it had left a ghost behind. Chicago had shown the world its beauty. Now it would have to face its truth. The coming years would test that truth in fire once again, not from flames that burned wood, but from flames of rage and rebellion.
Part 5. The Pullman Strike. The day Chicago stopped the nation. The year 1894 opened under a gray sky and a gray mood. The White City had faded into smoke, and with it went Chicago's brief illusion of harmony. The panic of 1893 had plunged the nation into its worst depression yet. Banks failed, railroads went bankrupt, and a quarter of Chicago's workers were jobless. Nowhere was the misery more concentrated than in the model town of Pullman, where neat brick houses lined streets named for virtues: industry, prudence, and grace. They looked orderly from the outside. Inside, cupboards were bare. A paradise turns prison. George Pullman had once boasted that his company town proved capital and labor may walk hand in hand. But when orders for luxury sleeping cars collapsed, he cut wages by as much as 30% and left the rents unchanged. Every paycheck returned straight to the company through rent and groceries at Pullman-owned stores. Men took home pennies. Women pawned wedding rings for bread. In the evenings, desperate workers gathered in the shadow of the Pullman clock tower, whispering about revolt. A young woman named Jenny Curtis, a seamstress earning $6 a week, later recalled, "We stitched his cars of velvet while our children cried for milk." Pullman refused to listen. "Business," he said curtly, "must take its course." The making of a leader. A few miles north, in a small office on Wabash Avenue, Eugene V. Debs studied reports from across the railroads. Debs, tall and soft-spoken, was no firebrand. A former locomotive fireman turned organizer, he believed in cooperation between workers and owners until the owners broke every promise. In 1893, he founded the American Railway Union, a bold experiment uniting every kind of rail worker, from engineers to porters. Within months, the ARU had over 100,000 members, many of them in Chicago. When Pullman's employees walked off the job in May 1894, they turned to Debs for help. He hesitated.
The ARU had just won a major strike and was exhausted. But when he visited the town and saw the shuttered houses, the empty eyes of hungry families, he made his decision. We have tried arbitration. Now we will try resistance. The spark. On May 11th, 3,000 Pullman workers struck. At first, Chicago barely noticed. Strikes were common. But Debs proposed a new tactic, a boycott. If the Pullman Company would not negotiate, no ARU member anywhere in the country would handle Pullman cars. By late June, the boycott had spread to 27 states, halting rail traffic from the Great Lakes to the Pacific. Trains idled in rail yards, passengers fumed, freight rotted on sidings. It was the first nationwide labor action in U.S. history. Newspapers screamed, "Rebellion on the rails." Business leaders called it anarchy. To the men and women in the tenements, it felt like justice at last. Chicago paralyzed. Chicago became the strike's beating heart. Every major rail line converged there, and every one of them stopped. By July 1st, more than 125,000 workers were off the job. Switchmen blocked tracks with boxcars. Strikers paraded through the streets singing union hymns, and the city's newspapers thundered both outrage and admiration. Mayor John Hopkins, fearing violence, pleaded for calm. Debs urged his followers to stay peaceful. He said, "We are not destroyers. We are builders of a new order." But anger had its own momentum. On July 4th, a crowd derailed a mail train south of the city. Federal officials seized their excuse. Troops in the streets. President Grover Cleveland, under pressure from railroad magnates and Attorney General Richard Olney, a former railroad lawyer, declared the strike a threat to the nation's mail service and sent 2,000 federal troops to Chicago, without consulting the governor of Illinois. When soldiers arrived on July 6th, the air stank of coal smoke and fear. Strikers massed along Halsted and 63rd Streets, shouting, "No bayonets for Pullman!" Rifle shots cracked. A freight yard burst into flames. By nightfall, the sky glowed red again, eerily like 1871. For 3 days, the city burned. Rail cars, depots, warehouses. The Chicago Tribune estimated $80 million in damage. At least 30 people were killed, hundreds wounded. Debs watched from his office window, horrified. He said, "This is not our war," but the government had already chosen sides. Crushing the Union. Federal injunctions outlawed the strike. Debs and the ARU leadership were arrested for contempt of court. With its head cut off, the movement collapsed. By mid-July, trains moved again under armed guard. The Pullman Company reopened, without concessions, without apology. In prison, Debs read Marx and emerged a socialist. The Pullman town remained intact, its lawns trimmed, its rents due on the 1st of every month. The nation takes note. The strike shook America to its core. For the first time, ordinary citizens saw the federal government act not as neutral arbiter, but as defender of capital. Newspapers from San Francisco to Boston debated whether democracy could survive when business held such power. Outrage led Congress to create the Labor Day holiday the next year, a symbolic olive branch, little comfort to the families of the dead. Pullman himself never recovered his public image. When he died in 1897, his family buried him under tons of concrete and steel to protect the grave from angry workers. A city transformed again. Chicago, once the phoenix of progress, had now become the crucible of labor. From the fire of 1871 to the bullets of 1894, Every rebirth came at a cost, yet each time the city emerged larger, tougher, more central to the American story. Eugene Debs would later say, "Chicago taught me that you cannot build heaven on earth by keeping hell in your basement." The city's factories kept churning, the rails kept humming, but beneath them all the question burned: what is the price of progress?
The Great Chicago Fire, Birth of Modern America. Part 6. The City of Tomorrow. Skyscrapers, Immigrants, and the American Century. The dawn of the 20th century rose over Chicago like light through steel. Smoke still curled from the stockyards, but above it, new towers glittered. Impossible towers, narrow as church spires and taller than anything the world had ever seen. This was the age of the skyscraper, born from tragedy, forged in ambition, and Chicago was its cradle. The Steel Revolution. In 1901, the same year U.S. Steel was formed, Chicago's architects were no longer rebuilding, they were inventing. The great engineer William LeBaron Jenney had already built the Home Insurance Building back in 1885, the world's first structure to use a steel skeleton instead of solid masonry. But now, a new generation of visionaries was pushing higher. Louis Sullivan, the philosopher-architect, declared, "Form follows function." His protege, Frank Lloyd Wright, began experimenting with horizontal lines and open interiors, the first hints of the prairie style. Daniel Burnham, the White City's general, turned from marble dreams to iron logic, drafting the Plan of Chicago in 1909, a sweeping vision of order for a city bursting at the seams. Chicago, once hog butcher for the world, had become a laboratory for modernity. Every rivet, every beam, every elevator cable was a defiance of gravity and a declaration that America had arrived. The river of people. But the real force behind the city's rise wasn't steel. It was flesh and hope. Between 1890 and 1915, more than 1 million immigrants poured into Chicago. They came from Poland, Italy, Bohemia, Lithuania, Ireland, Russia, Greece, and beyond. Each brought their own faith, dialect, and hunger for a better life. The new arrivals filled entire neighborhoods. Pilsen, the Bohemian quarter of beer gardens and brass bands. Little Italy, where sausage hung in windows and opera arias floated from open doors. Back of the yards, a sprawling warren of frame houses near the stockyards, where Polish and Irish families lived in the stink of slaughtered cattle. In these neighborhoods, a new America was forming, loud, crowded, improvisational, and endlessly alive. The city was a mosaic of languages and smells: coal smoke, garlic, beer, blood. Children sold newspapers in accents their parents could barely read. Women washed laundry for the rich. Men labored 12-hour shifts in foundries that never cooled. It was brutal, yes, but also beautiful, because out of this chaos came identity. The jungle. No one captured it more vividly than Upton Sinclair. In 1904, the young socialist novelist came to Chicago stockyards to research what he thought was a labor story. What he found was a nightmare of filth and exploitation. His novel, The Jungle, published in 1906, was meant to expose the abuse of workers, but what shocked readers most was the food. He wrote of rats ground into sausage, of spoiled meat doused with chemicals, of men slipping into rendering vats and emerging as lard. He said, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." The national outrage led to the Pure Food and Drug Act and the creation of the FDA. Once again, Chicago had forced America to confront its own reflection and forced progress through disgust. Burnham's dream. While the city's underbelly writhed, its upper floors reached for utopia. Burnham, older now, unveiled the plan of Chicago in 1909, the first comprehensive blueprint for a modern metropolis. It envisioned broad boulevards, lakefront parks, and orderly grids, a civic symphony to tame industrial chaos. He repeated, "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood." His plan was more than architecture. It was ideology. He believed beauty could civilize the city, that grand design could heal moral decay.
The result was the Chicago Plan Commission, the first of its kind. Boulevards were widened. Michigan Avenue was reborn. The lakefront became public. The seed of the modern American city, planned, proud, vertical, was sown here. The Great Migration. Then came a new wave, not from across oceans, but from the American South. Beginning around 1916, tens of thousands of African Americans fled Jim Crow terror and poverty, following the iron rails northward to Chicago. They settled in the Black Belt, a narrow strip on the south side. There they found work in steel mills, stockyards, and rail yards, but also faced segregation, redlining, and violent hostility. The jazz clubs of Bronzeville became sanctuaries of joy and rebellion. By night, the city pulsed to new rhythms, cornet solos, blue notes, laughter rising over smoke. Out of oppression came the Chicago Renaissance, a precursor to Harlem's explosion of black art and intellect. Still, racism burned hot. The race riot of 1919 tore through the South Side after a black teenager, Eugene Williams, was killed for drifting into a whites-only beach. For a week, mobs raged. 38 dead, over 500 injured. The city's divisions of class, color, and creed were carved into its map. The Skyscraper Wars. Through the 1920s, the skyline exploded again. The Tribune Tower with its Gothic crown rose in 1925. Then came the Merchandise Mart, so vast it had its own zip code. And finally, Chicago Board of Trade, gleaming like a temple of commerce, with a statue of Ceres gazing over the loop. Each building was a sermon in steel, a hymn to profit, to power, to permanence. But the architects knew the irony. Permanence was an illusion. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, the boom ended overnight. Half-built towers stood silent. Soup lines curled around the same blocks where fortunes had been made. Yet even then, Chicago's spirit, raw, restless, inventive, refused to die. The machine and the people. As the 1930s unfolded, Chicago became the beating heart of industrial America. Factories churned out tractors, typewriters, and telephones. Union men organized anew, often under threat of Pinkerton violence. Mayor Anton Cermak built a political machine to rival Tammany Hall, uniting immigrants under one banner: jobs. Patronage, corruption, and loyalty, these were the gears that kept the city moving. And still above it all rose steel. When the Century of Progress Exposition opened in 1933, Chicago's second Great World's Fair, it shimmered in neon and chromium. Airplanes looped over the lakefront, and visitors marveled at televisions, zeppelins, and robots. It was a fair about tomorrow, born in the depths of despair. Where the White City had been marble purity, this was glass and light, sleek, modern, electric. The city that had burned, struck, and bled now proclaimed itself immortal. The American century began. By the 1940s, the United States was no longer a provincial republic. It was an empire of industry, and Chicago was its engine. During World War II,
Its factories produced bombers, tanks, and munitions by the millions. Women took over assembly lines. Immigrant sons went to fight in Europe and the Pacific. The city pulsed 24 hours a day, a metropolis that never slept, never stopped. At war's end, the soldiers came home to a city already dreaming of suburbs, cars, and freeways. Burnham's boulevards gave way to asphalt rivers. The future had arrived, but it looked nothing like the planners had imagined. The American century had begun, and Chicago, for better or worse, was its blueprint. Steel and smoke, hope and hunger, progress and pain intertwined. Epilogue to Part 6. Half a century after the Great Fire, Chicago had risen again and again, each time from its own contradictions. It was not just a city anymore, it was a mirror of the nation itself. Every triumph carried a wound. Every invention had a cost. Every dream left a shadow. The city had become a symbol of what America could be and what it might destroy to get there. The Great Chicago Fire, Birth of Modern America. Part 7. The Windy City in the Atomic Age. Power, Protest, and the New Frontier. At 3:25 p.m. on December 2, 1942, inside an abandoned squash court beneath the stands of Stagg Field at the University of Chicago, the world quietly crossed a threshold. Physicist Enrico Fermi, flanked by a handful of scientists in lab coats, watched the dials of a handmade reactor, graphite blocks stacked like black bricks, uranium pellets inside. A whisper went through the room. The reaction is self-sustaining. For the first time in history, humans had created a controlled nuclear chain reaction. It lasted only 4.5 minutes. No one outside the building knew. Yet, in that moment, the atomic age was born, and Chicago was its cradle. City of Science and Shadows. Fermi's experiment, Chicago Pile 1, was part of the top-secret Manhattan Project. Within months, its discoveries would lead to the bomb that ended World War II and changed every calculation of life and death thereafter. But Chicago's role didn't end there. The Argonne Laboratory rose in its outskirts, dedicated to nuclear energy for peace. Scientists dreamed of limitless power. Protesters warned of limitless risk. The same city that had forged steel for railroads now forged the atom for empire. Once again, Chicago was both the promise and the peril of progress. Factories to suburbs. When the war ended, soldiers returned to a transformed world. Factories retooled for peacetime goods, refrigerators, cars, televisions, and the post-war boom filled Chicago's coffers. Yet prosperity flowed unevenly. Middle-class families fled to the new suburbs, following the promise of lawns and driveways. Highways cut through old neighborhoods. Elevated expressways carved barriers of race and class. The South Side and West Side filled with those left behind, working-class black families, Appalachian migrants, Mexican laborers, trapped by redlining and restrictive covenants that kept them from moving north. The city grew richer and poorer at once. The era of the machine. Through the 1950s, Chicago was ruled by a new kind of monarch, Mayor Richard J. Daley, boss of the Democratic machine. Daley's empire stretched from City Hall to every ward captain and precinct worker. Jobs, permits, favors, everything flowed through his hand. Under him, the skyline soared again. Expressways, housing projects, O'Hare Airport, the modern city's arteries. But power came with fear. Police raids targeted civil rights groups and communist sympathizers.
Political dissent was managed as efficiently as garbage collection. Daley embodied Chicago itself, efficient, proud, unyielding, and convinced it knew best. Voices of a new America. Meanwhile, another Chicago was waking up. The jazz clubs of Bronzeville gave way to gospel churches and picket lines. The civil rights movement had arrived. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to Chicago in 1966, declaring that the North must face its own racism. He marched through white neighborhoods like Marquette Park, where crowds hurled rocks and insults. King later said, "I have never seen, even in Mississippi or Alabama, mobs as hostile and hate-filled as in Chicago." His marches forced the nation to confront what it preferred to ignore, that segregation was not a Southern disease, but an American one. At the same time, Cesar Chavez's supporters organized Latino workers in the city's food processing plants. Feminist collectives sprouted on university campuses. The Black Panthers opened free breakfast programs on the West Side.
The Windy City became a storm of ideas. 1968, the year the world watched. Nothing, however, matched the chaos of 1968. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. Chicago erupted in grief and flames. National Guardsmen patrolled the streets. 4 months later, the Democratic National Convention came to town, and so did the war protesters. As delegates met inside the International Amphitheater, thousands of students and activists filled Grant Park, chanting, "The whole world is watching." Police in riot helmets charged. Tear gas drifted over Michigan Avenue. Cameras caught every swing of a baton. Mayor Daley called it law and order. The rest of America saw brutality broadcast live. For a moment, Chicago was the country's mirror again, reflecting both its violence and its demand for change. The architecture of the future. Even amid turmoil, Chicago's builders kept dreaming. The 1960s and 70s brought a new skyline of glass and simplicity. The Marina City Towers, twin corncobs rising from the river, embodied urban renewal. Then came Sears Tower in 1973, 110 stories of black steel, the tallest building on Earth. Its construction was both practical and symbolic. America's industries might be moving, but Chicago still reached higher than anyone else. For millions, the city's silhouette, sharp, dark, audacious, was America's confidence made visible. Power and protest, hand in hand. By the late 1970s, Chicago was a paradox again. Factories closed as manufacturing shifted overseas. Unemployment soared in the neighborhoods that had built the nation's wealth. At the same time, the arts exploded. Blues, improv comedy, political theater, voices insisting the city's soul still mattered. Community organizers, many from Catholic parishes and black churches, fought block by block for housing, schools, and dignity. Among them was a young man from Hawaii and Kansas, Barack Obama, who arrived in 1985 to work on the South Side. He walked streets where factories once roared and churches now echoed with unemployment prayers. There, he learned the rhythm of Chicago politics and the patience it demanded. That quiet work would ripple outward until it reached the White House. The legacy of the atomic age. By the close of the 20th century, Chicago had become a city of contradictions that defined America itself. The birthplace of the atomic bomb, yet a center for peace activism.
the capital of machine politics, yet the training ground for reformers, the home of jazz and blues, yet also of glass and concrete modernism. Each reinvention cost something, but like Fermi's reactor, once the chain reaction began, it could never be stopped. Epilogue to Part 7. Standing on the lakefront at night, the city hums, streetlights reflecting off the water, the skyline flickering like a living circuit. From the cowpaths of 1830 to the nuclear laboratories of 1942, from soot to starlight, Chicago has been more than a city. It has been America's laboratory for ambition. Every fire, every protest, every plan carried the same pulse: to rebuild, to reimagine, to reach beyond. The Great Chicago Fire, Birth of Modern America. Part 8. City on the Make. The Post-Industrial Metropolis and the Future of the American Dream. The last smokestacks of the South Side fell quietly. No ceremony, no brass band, just the sound of wind whistling through empty brick shells where steel once glowed white-hot. By the 1980s, Chicago's industrial heart was gone. The stockyards had closed, the foundries rusted, the rail yards weed-choked. Entire neighborhoods that had fed the world now stood silent. And yet, somehow, the city refused to die. The end of the machine age. For over a century, Chicago's rhythm had been the hammer, the whistle, the shift bell. Now that music stopped. Globalization sent manufacturing overseas. The mills of South Chicago and Gary shuttered one by one. The men who had built skyscrapers and bombers found themselves jobless. You could walk the length of 95th Street, one laid-off worker told the Tribune in 1984, and hear nothing but the sound of your own boots. The old neighborhoods, back of the yards, South Deering, Pullman, became ghost parishes. Bars closed, churches boarded up, crime rose. But at the same time, downtown Chicago glittered brighter than ever. Corporate towers replaced smokestacks. Banks, insurance firms, and ad agencies filled the loop. The new gods of the city wore suits, not overalls. It was a pattern spreading across America, the service economy rising atop the ruins of the industrial one. Chicago was just its most vivid parable. City of Glass. The skyline became the symbol of a city rebranded. Architects like Helmut John and Mies van der Rohe's disciples turned the loop into a gallery of glass and light. The Thompson Center, opened in 1985, gleamed like a futuristic temple. On Wacker Drive, mirrored facades reflected the river that once carried slaughterhouse waste, now lined with cafes and tour boats. The Merchandise Mart reinvented itself as a tech hub, and the Sears Tower, renamed Willis Tower, remained a black monolith against the Midwestern sky, the exclamation mark at the end of Chicago's ambition. Yet, if the skyline was progress, the streets beneath told another story. Two Chicagos. By the 1990s, Chicago had split in two. One city was global, clean, vertical, cosmopolitan. It spoke in MBA jargon and stock prices. The other was local, poor, horizontal, invisible to the first. It spoke in broken schools, boarded homes, and bus stops without heat. The Cabrini green housing projects became national symbols of urban decay. Towers built as utopian social housing in the 1950s, now infamous for violence and neglect. The Chicago Housing Authority began demolishing them in the late 1990s, promising mixed-income communities. Many residents never found new homes. The same city that had built the skyscraper now struggled to keep roofs over its poorest citizens. Still, resilience, that old Chicago inheritance, refused to fade. Churches became community centers. Street art bloomed where factories had fallen. And out of those streets came new voices, new sounds, new power. The music of reinvention. Every era of Chicago invents a soundtrack. In the 1920s, it was jazz and blues. In the 1980s, it was house music, born in the black and Latino clubs of the West Side. At the Warehouse, a DJ named Frankie Knuckles looped soul vocals over drum machines, creating a sound that would circle the globe. House music was joy against hardship, a beat that never stopped, even when the world did. It turned abandoned warehouses into sanctuaries of light. At the same time, Chicago hip-hop rose with raw realism. Common, Twista, and later Kanye West, each mapping the city's contradictions in verse, aspiration and anxiety, violence and vision, all spinning together. Culture, as always, was Chicago's truest industry. Harold Washington and the New Politics.
In 1983, something unprecedented happened. Chicago elected its first black mayor, Harold Washington. Brilliant, eloquent, and fiercely independent, Washington broke the back of the old daily machine. His victory was not just political, it was generational. For the first time, the city's black, Latino, and progressive white communities had united across wards. Washington promised fairness, transparency, and inclusion. He diversified city government, reformed contracts, and gave voice to neighborhoods long ignored. But his tenure was besieged. A block of hostile aldermen, the so-called Bertelyak 29, fought him at every turn. Still, Washington's charisma held the city together until his sudden death in 1987. For many Chicagoans, his funeral felt like the end of an era, a reminder that even in victory, the struggle was never done. The Millennium Metropolis. By the 2000s, the old industrial capital had become a global city, a place of art museums, skyscraper tourism, tech startups, and gourmet food halls. Mayor Richard M. Daley, son of the original boss, reigned through 6 terms. He beautified the downtown, built Millennium Park, and turned an abandoned rail yard into a futuristic garden crowned by Anish Kapoor's Cloud Gate, the gleaming sculpture Chicagoans instantly nicknamed the Bean. Tourists flocked. The city's image was reborn, not smoke and slaughter, but sparkle and skyline. Yet, just a few miles away, gun violence and poverty haunted entire generations. In neighborhoods like Inglewood and Austin, school closures and disinvestment hollowed out communities. The wealth gap widened like a fault line beneath the towers. Chicago had reinvented itself again, but its reflection was fractured. The New American Dream. In 2008, one of the city's own stood before the world and promised renewal. Barack Obama, once a South Side community organizer, accepted the presidency under the night sky of Grant Park, the same ground where protesters had been beaten in 1968. Hundreds of thousands gathered in the cold, tears freezing on cheeks as he said, "If there is anyone out there who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible, tonight is your answer." For a moment, Chicago was not just America's mirror, it was its heart. After the glory.
But history never pauses. In the years that followed, economic shocks, political corruption, and racial tension returned like old ghosts. Police violence, especially the 2014 killing of Laquan McDonald, ignited outrage. New waves of immigrants from Latin America and Asia reshaped the city's neighborhoods, while automation and inequality tested its resilience anew. Yet, Chicago remained what it had always been: a laboratory for democracy, a forge for reinvention, a city too stubborn to give up its dream. Epilogue: The Future Rising. Walk down the riverfront today, and the past whispers from every stone. The air hums with construction cranes and commuter trains. Young coders sip coffee in old warehouses where factory men once sweated. At sunset, the skyline glows like embers, as if the city is still burning, slowly, endlessly into its next form. Chicago never stops rebuilding itself because America never stops needing the story it tells. That from ruin comes renewal, that from division comes design, that even in failure, there is faith in the next morning's work. It is not a perfect city, but it is a true one, and as long as it stands, so does the dream it was built on.